The millionaire's daughter was only 7 days old when the doctor finally said the words Victoria Hamilton didn't want to hear. "I'm sorry, but there's nothing more we can do. The syndrome is too rare. Her liver has simply stopped working." Victoria held little Isabella close to her chest, feeling her fragile little body fight for every breath. 7 days. That was all her daughter had lived in this world, and now the best pediatric specialists in the country were giving up on her. "Is there any possibility of a transplant?" she asked, her voice breaking, already knowing the answer that would come. "For a baby only a week old, we would need a compatible donor immediately. And even then," Dr. Peterson shook his head gravely, "the chances are slim." On the other side of the neonatal ICU glass, Antonio Silva watched the scene in silence. At 32, he had been working as a driver and personal assistant for the Hamilton family for only 6 months, but he had accompanied them to every doctor's appointment, every test, every night of despair since Isabella was born. Victoria never noticed how Antonio always stayed longer than necessary at the hospital. How he asked the doctors specific questions when she wasn't around. How his eyes filled with tears every time he looked at that little girl fighting for her life. What she didn't know was that Antonio had been keeping a secret for years. A secret he discovered at 19, when he tried to enlist in the army and underwent all the mandatory medical exams. He had an extremely rare blood type. Only 1 in 500,000 people had that specific combination. "It's like winning the genetic lottery," the military doctor had joked at the time. "You can save lives that no one else could save." Antonio never thought those words would make so much sense years later, watching a 7-day-old baby waste away while her boss cried helplessly. He had heard the doctor's comment on the rarity of the blood type needed. He had seen the test results scattered across the office table. And he knew exactly what he had to do. That night, while Victoria finally fell asleep exhausted in the chair next to the incubator, Antonio remained in the hallway looking through the glass. His Isabella seemed smaller with each passing hour, his purple lips struggling against the artificial respirator. He pulled a yellowed envelope from his pocket, his own blood tests from years ago, which he had carried in his wallet since the day she discovered her genetic peculiarity. For a moment, he hesitated. He was just the driver. A black employee of a wealthy white family. Who would believe that he wanted to help out of genuine love, and not out of self-interest? But when Isabella opened her little eyes for a few seconds and seemed to look directly at him through the glass, Antonio knew there was no turning back. If you are enjoying this story of courage and overcoming adversity, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what this man was about to do would forever change the definition of family, proving that true love knows no color, social class, or barriers imposed by prejudice. The next morning, Antonio arrived at the hospital 2 hours earlier than usual. He needed to talk to Dr. Peterson before Victoria woke up, before the other doctors arrived, before he lost his courage. "I'm sorry, sir, but the neonatal ICU does not allow unauthorized visitors," said the nurse at the desk, not even looking up from her computer when he approached. "I work for the Hamilton family. I need to talk to the doctor about baby Isabella." A woman finally looked at him, observing her simple clothes and black skin. "The driver, right? Look, you'll have to wait for Mrs. Hamilton to arrive. Doctors don't discuss cases with employees." Antonio felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he had experienced 15 years ago when he graduated from medical school at the public university, but couldn't get a residency at any private hospital because he didn't have the right profile to deal with high-class patients. He had given up on medicine after 3 years of trying for an opportunity. He worked as a nurse in low-income clinics, then as an ambulance driver, until he accepted the job with the Hamilton family. But he never forgot his knowledge, never stopped studying on his free nights. "I can wait," he said calmly, sitting down in the hallway. When Victoria arrived 2 hours later, his eyes were swollen from crying. Isabella had had a terrible night, convulsions, uncontrolled temperature, increasingly weak vital signs. "Mrs. Hamilton," Antonio stood up as she passed. "Can I talk to you?" Victoria stopped, surprised. In 6 months of working together, Antonio had never initiated a personal conversation. "Of course, Antonio. What is it?" He pulled the yellowed envelope from his pocket, his hands trembling slightly. I can help Isabella." Victoria frowned, confused. "How?" "I have the blood type she needs. The same one the doctors said would be impossible to find. I had these tests done years ago and," her voice faltered for a moment. I would like to be tested as a donor. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria looked at him as if she were speaking another language. Antonio, that's very kind of you, but you don't understand. The doctors said she would need a compatible donor from the family, someone with genetic ties. With all due respect, ma'am, they're wrong. Antonio opened the envelope and showed her the papers. Blood type O negative with Duffy antigen negative. Only 1 in 500,000 people have that combination. He's one of them. Victoria took the papers, but Antonio could see the hesitation in his eyes. Not mistrust about the tests, but about him. A black driver wanting to donate part of his liver to save the daughter of a white millionaire? What kind of interest could he possibly have? Antonio, I deeply appreciate her offer. But this is very complex. The doctors would need to evaluate so many things, and there are legal issues, and... Can I talk to him directly? Antonio interrupted gently. Just to show him the tests? Victoria nodded, but Antonio could tell that she had already decided that it wouldn't work. 30 minutes later, Dr. Peterson examined the papers with obvious irritation. Sir? Silva. Antonio Silva. Mr. Silva, I understand his concern about the situation, but organ donation is an extremely complex process that goes far beyond blood compatibility. There are genetic factors, histocompatibility issues, hospital protocols. I understand perfectly, doctor. Antonio kept his voice calm. That's why I suggested specific tests for HLA antigens, cross-matching, and... Dr. Peterson interrupted him, clearly surprised by his technical knowledge. How do you know these terms? Antonio hesitated. Revealing her medical training would be admitting that he had been undercover as a driver for years. I've done a lot of research on her case. Look, the doctor sighed impatiently, even if you are compatible, there are protocols. A living donor must undergo psychiatric, social, and financial evaluations. Hospitals do not accept donors who may have questionable motives. The implication was clear. A poor black man, a man, wanting to donate an organ to a rich white child could only have ulterior motives. What kind of motives? Antonio asked quietly. Well, you've only been working for the family for a short time. Organ donation is a significant gesture. Some may question whether there are expectations of financial compensation or other benefits. Antonio felt anger rising in his throat, but he took a deep breath. Doctor, if you'll allow him, he'd just like to have the specific tests done. If he's not a match, forget he ever suggested this. Dr. Peterson looked at Victoria, who nodded hesitantly. All right. But don't get your hopes up. The chances are slim, and even if you are compatible, there are many other issues involved. 3 days later, Antonio received a call. Dr. Peterson's voice sounded different, tense, almost incredulous. Mr. Silva? You need to come back to the hospital. Today. Antonio knew exactly what that tone meant. The tests had confirmed what he already knew. He was a perfect match. So perfect that it would be statistically impossible to find another donor like him. But when he arrived at the hospital, he found Victoria crying in the hallway and a group of doctors in heated discussion. Mrs. Hamilton, he approached. What happened? Victoria lifted her tear-stained face. The tests, you are indeed compatible. Perfectly compatible. She paused, as if she couldn't believe her own words. But they won't authorize the surgery. Antonio felt his heart race. Why? It was Dr. Peterson who answered, avoiding his gaze. The hospital ethics committee has decided that there are too many risk factors involved. Liability issues, safety protocols. Translation, Antonio said slowly, you don't trust him. The silence was the answer he needed. That night, alone in his small apartment, Antonio looked out the window and thought of the 7-day-old baby fighting for her life a few miles away. He thought of Victoria, who treated him well but never really saw him as someone capable of saving her daughter. He thought of the doctors who questioned his motives simply because he was black and poor. He opened his old laptop and began to search. There were other options. Other hospitals, perhaps in other states, where the rules were different. Where a man like him could save a child without her skin color being seen as a risk factor. Because Isabella was dying, and he had in his body exactly what she needed to live. And if the system wouldn't let him do it the right way, maybe it was time to find out how many rules a man desperate to save a life was willing to break. What those doctors didn't know was that Antonio Silva wasn't just a well-meaning driver. He was a trained doctor who had spent 15 years studying exactly this type of surgery, waiting for a chance to prove that competence has no skin color. Antonio didn't sleep that night. Sitting at the kitchen table in his small apartment, surrounded by stacks of printed medical articles and pediatric surgery books, he reverted to who he really was, Dr. Antonio Silva, who had graduated from a federal university with a medical degree 15 years ago. He had lied to the Hamilton family from day one. Not because he wanted to deceive them, but because he knew that a black doctor who had been unemployed for years due to prejudice would not even get an interview for a driver's job with a wealthy white family. It was easier to be just a competent driver than to explain why a medical graduate was driving cars. But now, looking at Isabella's medical records, which he had discreetly photographed during consultations, Antonio saw exactly what the doctors were missing. Isabella's syndrome was rare, yes, but there were documented cases of successful transplants. The problem wasn't medical, it was political. At 3 in the morning, his phone rang. It was Dr. James Mitchell, his college classmate who now ran the pediatric transplant program at St. Mary's Children's Hospital in another state. Antonio? Man, it's been years since we last spoke. I saw her message about the neonatal liver transplant case. Antonio explained everything: Isabella, the perfect compatibility tests, the hospital's refusal on ethical grounds. My God, James sighed on the other end of the line. Are you telling me he rejected a perfectly compatible donor because he thinks you have ulterior motives? That's medical insanity. James, I need help. This child will die if we don't do something. Wait a minute. You said you work as a driver? What happened to her medical career? Antonio hesitated before telling the truth, how he had been rejected from every residency program 15 years ago, despite his excellent grades. How he had tried private clinics and been dismissed for not having the right profile for our patients. How he had given up on medicine and taken any job that paid the bills. Man, that's unacceptable. You were one of the best in our class. James was silent for a moment. Antonio, what if I told his that I can authorize this transplant here? Our protocols are different. As long as he passes the medical and psychological evaluations, we can do the surgery. Antonio felt his heart race. Would you do that? Of course I would. But there's a problem. You'd need to bring the baby here without the consent of her current doctors. Technically, it would be transferring a critically ill patient without formal medical authorization. What about the legal risks? For his sake, enormous. For me, manageable if we justify it as a medical emergency. But Antonio, if something goes wrong during transport or surgery, he could be held criminally liable. Antonio looked at the photo of Isabella he had placed on the refrigerator, the baby sleeping in Victoria's arms, still unaware that she was dying. James, I accept all the risks. The next day, Antonio arrived at the Hamilton mansion with a plan. He needed to convince Victoria to seek a second medical opinion, without revealing the whole truth about her qualifications. Mrs. Hamilton, may I speak with her? Victoria was in the living room, looking out the window. She had cried so much in recent weeks that her eyes looked permanently red. Of course, Antonio. I know a doctor who specializes in pediatric transplants. Dr. James Mitchell, at St. Mary's Hospital. He would like to evaluate Isabella's case. Victoria turned, surprised. How do you know a transplant specialist? Antonio had prepared this answer. My sister works as a nurse at that hospital. She mentioned the case to Dr. Mitchell, and he was interested. It was a lie, but a lie that could save a life. Antonio, the doctors here have been very clear. There is no more hope. With all due respect, ma'am, sometimes it's worth hearing a second opinion. Dr. Mitchell has saved children in similar cases. Victoria hesitated. Over the past few days, she had noticed something different about Antonio. He asked the doctors technical questions that an ordinary driver would not ask. He used medical terms with ease. And there was a determination in his eyes that went beyond the simple concern of an employee. You understand medicine, Antonio? Antonio took a deep breath. It was time to reveal part of the truth. Yes, ma'am. I have a degree in medicine. I haven't practiced for a few years due to personal circumstances. But I never stopped studying. Victoria stared at him, shocked. You're a doctor? Why didn't you tell me that before? Because I knew you wouldn't hire me. An unemployed black doctor doesn't inspire confidence in families like her. The brutal honesty of the answer hit Victoria like a slap in the face. She knew he was right. She would never have hired a doctor as a driver. She would have immediately suspected his motives or competence. Antonio, I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, ma'am. You just have to let me try to save Isabella. At that moment, Victoria's phone rang. It was Dr. Peterson. Mr. Hamilton, I'm sorry to inform you that Isabella's condition has deteriorated significantly in the last few hours. We recommend that you prepare for the worst. Victoria collapsed on the sofa, sobbing. Antonio knelt beside her. Mrs. Hamilton, give me 24 hours. Let me take her to Dr. Mitchell. If it doesn't work, at least we tried everything. Victoria looked at him through her tears. If you're really a doctor, why aren't you saving lives instead of driving cars? Because the system doesn't let men like him save lives, Antonio replied softly. But that doesn't mean he's going to give up trying. Victoria knew she was making the riskiest decision of her life. But looking at Antonio, really looking at he for the first time in 6 months, she saw something she had completely missed: hope. All right. But Antonio, if anything happens to her during this trip, I take full responsibility. And Mrs. Hamilton, his real name is Dr. Antonio Silva. That's how he wants Isabella to know him when she grows up. For the first time since Isabella's birth, Victoria smiled. It wasn't happiness, it was relief at finally finding someone willing to fight when everyone else had given up. While Antonio discreetly arranged for the medical transfer, Victoria watched from the window. She had spent 6 months living with a doctor disguised as a driver, a man who understood exactly what her daughter was going through, but who had to hide his true identity because of her own prejudices. And now that same man was risking everything, his freedom, his career, his life, to save a child who wasn't even her daughter. Victoria realized that Isabella wasn't just lucky to have found a compatible donor. She was lucky to have found someone who loved her enough to defy an entire system that said he wasn't worthy of saving her. What Victoria didn't know yet was that in less than 12 hours, Antonio would put Isabella in his car and drive 8 hours to another state, carrying portable medical equipment that he had borrowed from a hospital, betting her life and freedom on the hope that love would be stronger than all the prejudices that almost let a child die simply because her savior had the wrong skin color. At 5 in the morning, Antonio placed Isabella in the back seat of his car, surrounded by portable medical equipment he had discreetly borrowed from a hospital during his months of work. Heart monitor, infusion pump, oxygen tank, all powered by batteries he had charged throughout the night. Victoria sat next to her daughter, holding her little hand as she watched Antonio connect the last cables with surgical precision. You really know what you're doing, don't you? Yes, ma'am. Trust me. The 8-hour trip was a race against time. Every 2 hours, Antonio stopped to check Isabella's vital signs, adjust medications, and change 4 bags. Victoria watched in fascination as he underwent a complete transformation. The shy driver had disappeared, replaced by a confident, competent doctor who knew exactly how to keep a 7-day-old baby stable during a medical emergency. Antonio, she said during one of the stops, why did you really hide all these months? He adjusted the monitor before answering. Because I know how the world works, Mrs. Hamilton. An unemployed black doctor would be viewed with suspicion. A competent driver would just be efficient. It was easier to take care of Isabella by being underestimated than by being questioned. At St. Mary's Hospital, Dr. James Mitchell waited with the entire surgical team at the ready. When he saw Antonio get out of the car carrying Isabella with medical equipment working perfectly, he smiled. My goodness, Antonio. You've turned his car into a mobile ICU. Isabella couldn't wait for bureaucratic protocols, Antonio replied, transferring the baby to a hospital stretcher. James, meet Victoria Hamilton. Mrs. Hamilton, Dr. James Mitchell, the best pediatric surgeon I know. The next 6 hours were the most tense of Victoria's life. Antonio remained in the operating room as an assistant surgeon, her first surgery in 15 years, but her hands moved with the precision of someone who had never stopped mentally practicing each procedure. My God, Dr. Mitchell murmured during the operation, Her suturing technique is impeccable. Where did she graduate from, again? Federal University. Class of 2008. And why did she stop practicing? Antonio paused before answering, focused on delicately connecting the blood vessels. Because no hospital wanted to give her a chance. They said I didn't have the right profile to work with certain families. Dr. Mitchell stopped operating for a moment. Antonio, you're saving this child's life with a technique that rivals Harvard surgeons. Any hospital that rejected you lost one of the best professionals they could have had. Meanwhile, 400 miles away, Dr. Peterson received a call that made him pale. What do you mean they took the patient to another state? Who authorized that? Sir, said the nervous nurse, the family's driver. Apparently he's a doctor. He transferred the baby to a specialized hospital in the middle of the night. Dr. Peterson felt his blood run cold. A doctor disguised as a driver had been observing all the procedures for months, questioning decisions, taking notes. And they had rejected the only compatible donor simply because they didn't trust her motives. Call the legal department, he shouted. Now. But it was too late. At 3 in the afternoon, Dr. James Mitchell emerged from the operating room with a weary smile. The surgery was a complete success. Antonio's liver has adapted perfectly to Isabella's body. She is stable, awake, and responding well. Victoria collapsed in the hallway, crying with relief. Antonio, still wearing his surgical scrubs, approached slowly. Can I see her? Victoria asked. In the pediatric ICU, Isabella was awake for the first time in weeks. Her lips were pink, her breathing was calm, and when she saw Victoria, she flashed what might have been a smile. She's going to live, Antonio said softly, watching the monitors. Completely. No sequelae. Victoria looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in 6 months. You saved my daughter. And I spent all this time treating him like a driver. Because that's what I was to her. And that's okay. No, it's not okay. Victoria took his hand. You're the most competent doctor I've ever met, and I let my prejudices blind me. How many other extraordinary professionals do I despise every day just because they don't look like me? At that moment, Victoria's phone rang. It was an unknown number. Mrs. Hamilton? The voice was tense, official. This is Dr. Peterson from the hospital where Isabella was admitted. We need to talk urgently about the patient's irregular transfer. There are serious legal issues involved. Victoria looked at Antonio, who was calmly checking the vital signs of her daughter, the daughter who was alive thanks to he. Dr. Peterson, she said with a coldness she had never used before, he had months to save my daughter and chose to follow protocols instead of accepting the only compatible donor. Now she is alive thanks to a doctor you deemed untrustworthy. But ma'am, there are regulations, legal responsibilities. Doctor. Victoria interrupted, get ready to explain to a court why you rejected a perfectly qualified donor. Because as we speak, she's calling the best law firm she knows. She hung up and looked at Antonio. I hope you're prepared to never hide again. Because the whole world is going to know who really saved Isabella. Antonio smiled for the first time in months, not the polite smile of the driver, but the confident smile of Dr. Antonio Silva. Ms. Hamilton, I didn't hide because I was afraid of failure. I hid because I knew that when my true competence was revealed, it would be impossible to ignore how many other people like me are being wasted by a system that judges by appearance rather than character. In the next 48 hours, the story leaked to the press. Black doctor disguised as driver saves baby rejected by elite hospital. The headline spread like wildfire, and Antonio would discover that saving Isabella was just the beginning of a revolution that would change not only her lives, but an entire system that would finally be forced to confront its own prejudices. What none of them knew yet was that the real battle was just beginning, because when a man proves the system wrong, the system does not easily give up his arrogance. 6 months later, Isabella ran through the garden of the Hamilton mansion, her rosy cheeks and infectious laughter echoing through what was once a silent house of despair. Antonio watched her from the terrace, now wearing his white coat, Dr. Antonio Silva, the new director of the pediatric transplant program at St. Mary's Hospital. Dr. Peterson had been fired in public disgrace. The hospital faced a federal investigation into discriminatory practices, and 3 families were suing the institution for medical malpractice based on racial prejudice. His career was ruined, his name forever associated with the case of the undercover doctor who saved a life while specialists refused to help because of racism. Victoria approached, carrying a cup of coffee. "Antonio, this arrived today." She handed him an official letter. Invitation to speak at Harvard Medical School on overcoming systemic barriers in medicine. Antonio smiled, folding the letter carefully. 15 years ago, they rejected he, saying he didn't have the right profile. Today they want him to teach other doctors. And he's going to accept? Of course. How many other Antonio Silvas are driving cars when they should be saving lives? Isabella ran up to them, hugging Antonio's legs. "Daddy Tony, let's play." Victoria had insisted on formal adoption. Antonio was no longer the driver or the doctor in disguise. He was a father, chosen not by blood but by love that proved stronger than any prejudice. That night, as he put Isabella to bed, Antonio reflected on the journey. He had lost 15 years hiding his true identity, but he had gained something immeasurable, a daughter and the chance to transform a system that had almost let a child die out of pure prejudice. The best revenge was not to destroy the doctors who had rejected him. It was proving that competence, love, and dedication have no skin color, and that sometimes the greatest victories come from those society least expects. If this story of overcoming adversity and love touched his heart, subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that true greatness knows no limits imposed by prejudice, and that genuine love always finds a way to triumph over ignorance.